Welcome everybody to today's webinar. We are looking forward to a great session, a metadata masterclass, if you will, mining business critical data from metadata, from your unstructured data. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to our presenters for their introductions and to get into the meat of today's session. So Gary, we will start with you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Gary Rylander, and I'm Managing Director of Professional Services at Iron Mountain. I developed a strategic partnership with ActiveNAV 2 years ago, and it's been a marvelous partnership. We have a number of very happy clients, and the topic that we're going to be talking about today is sort of near and dear to my heart. A lot of our clients come to ActiveNAV and Iron Mountain because they're concerned about compliance issues, or they want to clean up their unstructured content before they move to the cloud. But that ends up leaving a lot of realizable business value on the table. So what Steve and I are going to talk about today is how you can kill two birds with one stone, how you can become compliant and also extract from your unstructured information a great deal of very valuable business metadata. Steve?
Thanks, Gary. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Steve Matthews, SVP of Strategic Global Accounts here at ActiveNAV. And as Gary said, we have a strategic partnership in place with Iron Mountain to help organizations overcome their data challenges, their dark data that's out there, shine a light on it, and help glean meaning and understanding, which is what we're going to cover through this metadata webinar. So where do we start? As Gary's already described, there's a whole raft of challenges and issues organizations are facing today. We all faced it pre-COVID, but COVID has accelerated some of these challenges and issues, and also some of the transformations that we're seeing in the marketplace. A lot of organizations are starting or accelerating their move towards the cloud, for example, to Microsoft 365. And as part of that, what we're finding is that you can do a lift and shift, but there is no business value to doing that as part of migrations. So this is the perfect opportunity to look at creating a rich set of metadata about the content in order that the data can be secured, protected, and managed effectively and found effectively moving forwards. Good examples of this may be looking for sensitive information in order to be able to apply data classifications to the content. An example again of that in the cloud environment would be something like Microsoft 365 Security and Compliance Center, whereby if the content is labeled correctly, it can be secured and protected, reducing the risk to the organization of data leakage or in the event of a breach. And data is growing all of the time. Nothing stays still. Latest research from Gartner is showing 40 to 50% data growth year on year. So doing nothing is not an option. But how do you get your arms around that content? Not just the content that's being added, but also the content that's been created in the past. And this is why we would call it dark data. A lot of those people will no longer be present. So how do you extract value, meaning, and understanding from the content when you don't know what you don't know? We're going to do a case study from one of our clients, Plains Midstream Canada, where they were failing environmental audits and wanted to find their critical intellectual property, their critical crown jewel data, if you like, in order that that could be secured and protected and used in the right way. And last, by certainly no means least, what we're seeing constantly these days is that organizations are looking to provide a holistic approach to all of their data, whether that's structured or unstructured, really want to get their arms around and build an inventory and catalog and create, if you like, master data management, MDM, and create metadata about the content that can be used by the organization, both for collaboration as well as securing information. So between ActiveNAV and Iron Mountain, we have a proven methodology for helping organizations get to the point of good information and data governance. So often we see that organizations try and eat that elephant in one sitting. So we're going to do great governance across all of our data, and we're going to do it today. Not so fast. It's a big, complex problem. You need to break it down into manageable component parts in order to maximize the chances of success. And again, you don't know what you don't know. So before you can start applying really good metadata to this content, we have to understand what the content is about. So often we hear organizations say, our data should be about X, Y, and Z. And then we find out, yes, that plays a part, but it's also about many other things that they had either not known about or had forgotten about over time. So starting with a data inventory, mapping out what content actually exists out there will put you in a position of strength as you move towards good data governance by identifying the size and scale of the problem and perhaps prioritizing areas that we want to look at. Because an awful lot of data that sits out there is going to be surplus to requirements. Perhaps it was never needed. And so by shining a light onto that dark data means that we can start making informed decisions about what to do with that content. We see this, the yellow circle there that talks about data cleansing. We can identify what we term as rot, redundant, obsolete, and trivial content. Data that has no value to the organization. But we don't have to just delete it. That can be triaged, so it could be quarantined, for example. As part of this process, we can also identify the risk within the data. What sensitive information exists? And if it's sensitive, what steps do we need to take to secure and protect that content? Which again is where metadata will come into play. By creating a rich set of metadata means that we can start securing and protecting those information assets. But as well as having this big pot of data, how can we restructure it? How could we organize it? Or how can we, for example, map this content against our records retention schedule so that we're not over retaining and only keeping data for as long as it is actually needed, and therefore, or thereby, reducing risk for the organization. And as we start moving through this process, this is where we start creating the rich set of metadata in order that other systems and applications can be used to, for example, for data loss prevention or permissions management, depending on data classifications, and also enabling people within the organization to find content more effectively and efficiently than they've been able to do so in the past. And again, last but certainly by no means least, data governance is not a one and done activity. Once you've made this effort to transform the organization, because it is a transformational exercise, you want to maintain good governance against that data moving forwards. And so policing this on a regular basis means that you can keep the house in order and mitigate risks and make sure that your efforts in getting to this point are not just thrown away. We see a wide variety of use cases within the marketplace, but they're solidifying around certain key use cases. Data mapping, the data inventory, help understand what is out there so that you can start prioritizing and start organizing programs and projects. Particularly right now, there's an awful lot of divestitures and acquisitionings happening in the marketplace. And that's a big problem. How do you identify not just what applications need to go as part of a divestiture, but what data? And our software is being used very much to help organizations as part of that divestiture process and reduce the risk and the cost of preparing for that. A critical thing these days is finding not just the at-risk data, so the data that you don't want exposed, but also your crown jewel information, your critical intellectual property or data assets. that you don't want to get into the wrong hands, both internally and externally. So identifying and securing crown jewel data is becoming a critical component to these programs. The records management or migration to Microsoft 365 is also huge. More and more organizations are using the transformation of moving to the cloud as a means of not so much getting their house in order, but enabling them to get a number of benefits that perhaps over the recent years they haven't been able to secure funding or budget for. And wrapping that up into the transformation program means that you can start to realize some of the benefits around these different use cases. And of course, data privacy is key. And I'm sure everyone's seen the news about the record fine that's been leveraged by the EU against Amazon in recent times. And so being able to identify and secure that at-risk data means that organizations can feel more comfortable about being in compliance with these regulations that are starting to have some teeth behind them.
So the last use case on this slide really gets to the heart of what today's presentation is about. Since the dawn of computer science many decades ago, unstructured and structured data have tended to live in different environments, frequently been managed by different people. And it's always been a struggle to be able to not only identify what's in unstructured data, but then to be able to combine it with structured data to give you a single view of all the information in your computing environment about these things. Unstructured data lives in as documents and shared drives. It lives in SharePoint. It lives in enterprise content management platforms. And the structured data lives in, for the most part, relational databases. But we have the ability to federate across those data silos to give you a complete picture based on all of the information you have about a given topic. Did you pass one, Steve, or?
This is on you, Gary. Can you see the screen?
Yeah, it says build out repeatable processes.
Yeah, that's right.
That's your slide.
Okay, so one of the things that we would always recommend, again, about going back to not eating the elephant all in one sitting, is you need to start small in order to scale and grow to big. And part of that is looking at taking one or two business areas, and we certainly wouldn't recommend doing IT, for example, or even perhaps legal, because they're kind of outliers, and taking a couple of the business areas and running the whole process end to end to build out a repeatable process to incorporate lessons learned. Because again, with any of these programs, and if you're looking at governance and metadata and creating metadata as part of these governance initiatives, it's not a small undertaking. And it's about people, process, and technology. And change management is a critical component here. Too often we've seen organizations overlook the change management side and say, we've got a great IT solution, it's going to solve all our problems. And then it all falls apart. Because IT software is software. It doesn't cater for people and the nuances. You have to bring the people along with you. And so that's one of the key reasons we would say, start, refine the process, get it right before you ramp up the rollout of the program. Don't try and do it all at once, because that's a surefire recipe for failure.
Once we've teased out the structured data that we're interested in from unstructured documents, it then becomes a pretty simple matter to just do a straightforward SQL query against both the structured application as well as the ActiveNAV SQL server. So for example, if we were looking for information about an insurance policy, we can, as part of the ActiveNAV metadata tagging process, we can create a regular expression that identifies the insurance policy numbers that are spread across spreadsheets and presentations, emails, Word documents, you name it. And then we can do a single unified query that would enable you to do a query against both the structured application that was the database for your policies, and at the same time, come up with a hit list from ActiveNAV of all the documents that had that same policy number. So once we've done the work, this is how it would fit together and give you that unified view across silos. The next aspect that we want to talk about is just one of the realities of what happens when you try and do a project like this across what could be very significant amounts of unstructured data based purely on being compliant. It doesn't always work. Next slide. So I am sure that many of the folks sitting in today are members of AIM. And a few years ago, AIM surveyed its members and asked them what happens when they try and really do any sort of program based purely on compliance. Well, what happens is where compliance with records management statutes, for example, is the primary driver, and it was for a lot of them, the unfortunate result is that there's no commitment to get it done. The investment is not made and nothing happens. And that may change somewhat with privacy as a new fang in the regulatory dragon's mouth. But it's still the case that people don't want to spend money on compliance. They consider it a cost of doing business, and they do as little frequently as they can get away with. On the other hand, next slide, we also know, based on another survey from AIM from a few years ago, that when people approach getting this technology based on improving business outcomes, the results are often very, very different. And mind you, this is a lot of the same sort of technology that we're talking about. But if you approach this based upon making business processes work faster, having fewer bottlenecks in the process, and being able to do that by having a complete view of all of your information related to critical business issues, what happens there is for almost everybody, they get a positive ROI within 18 months or so. And that is how you get a project like this funded. The expression I use in talking to my clients is pay for the business improvement, get the compliance for free, because that's really what it amounts to. You need the same technology to do both, but base it on improving the business outcomes.
So I wanted to share a couple of case studies with you about organizations that have put this into action and have got meaningful results out of it. So I talked earlier about Plains Midstream Canada, and they had some challenges that were called out in their annual reports as it related to their environmental assessments and audits and finding the right data. And they were in the process of moving to a new platform. In this case, it was Microsoft 365. As with many oil and gas customers, lots of acquisitions and divestitures. So a huge amount of data collected over the years. And to be honest, very little data governance applied to that unstructured content sat out there on file shares and the like. So they thought that there was an awful lot of rot data that was set out there, but they were really unable to quantify that or to qualify their their view that this existed. They also had no idea what levels, if any, of sensitive information were out there. So as part of their transformation to move across to 365, they wanted to take the opportunity to not just reduce the cost associated with the IT, but also take the time to look at their data in more detail, to get their arms around that content and that data and understand what truly was valuable, what really had no business value moving forward, and how to structure and organize it so they could work more effectively in their new environment. So
And
it was fascinating.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Steve. I didn't mean to cut you off.
It was fascinating because just when the first area, the first group that was moving to the cloud, over 50% of their content was deemed out of scope for migration. So again, going back to this triage, didn't mean that they would necessarily delete it, but it doesn't need to be moved across to the new platform and the new environment, taking up valuable space and making it harder for people to find those needles in the haystack. So that was a significant reduction in effort right from the get-go. Plains have actually published a case study around this particular project. And they have said quite openly that they believe it would have taken over 9 years of manual labor effort to achieve the same results that we were able to achieve by people, process, and technology within a 3 to 4 month window. But not only was it about getting rid of that rot and making sure that that junk wasn't brought across to the new environment, able to also restructure the content. And this is where metadata becomes so invaluable. For example, we were able to identify critical asset numbers and equipment numbers, which then meant they were, as we migrated that content to their SharePoint environment, they were able to, we were able to inherit a whole set of other metadata relating to locations and everything else, keying off of that critical asset number, which means that users are not having to manually label that content and create that set of metadata with all the risks that will ensue of it being wrong. And 9 times out of 10, it will be wrong. And also enabled them to really shine a light on that dark data that had been created over the years in such a way that they could minimize the disruption to the business, because any governance initiative or metadata initiative, you need to think and consider about how you minimize the disruption to the day-to-day business operations and your users. Because if you swamp your users with huge amounts of results to review, or just give them a blank sheet of paper and say, fill out this form, typically nothing is going to happen. So again, coming back to this, it's people, process, and technology, and it can really benefit organizations and get some really substantial gains.
And you know, Steve, Plains is a good proof point for something you said earlier about not trying to do everything at once. So Plains started with just Canadian data, and then more recently has signed up for a US agreement as well, using the lessons it learned in Canada and now applying it to its data footprint in the US.
Absolutely. And obviously we have this quote here from Erin at Plains, but it's really that last sentence that says it all for me, where she talks about, it's not just about the cost savings, because you could say it's sunk costs because it's people anyway. It's that it would not practically be possible for a bunch of human beings to do this. And we see this so much. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, it's all the rage right now, data classification, and looking at applying data classification labels to content so they can be secured and protected through its life cycle. Well, there's a problem with a lot of this, and I'll give you some anecdotes around this. As an example, if you rely on users to manually label that content, we are seeing in many instances with customers that 40% plus of the labels that users are applying are incorrect and are of a lower classification than they really should be. So for example, files that may be full of personal information are being labeled as public, when quite clearly they shouldn't be. And so again, relying just on users is not going to give you the answers or the results that you need. And so being able to audit manual activities, being able to automate labeling in order that the right controls and processes can be applied is critical. And you are not going to get that by relying on human beings alone, particularly when in many instances you may have hundreds of millions of files that have been created over the years. No one's going to review hundreds of millions of files one by one.
The next case study is a regional bank that found, like all the other banks, it had made many, many loans using the LIBOR base rate. And LIBOR is supposed to be retired by the end of 2021. So this bank needed to identify which loans use the LIBOR rate and what kind of loans were they. Based on the they asked us to identify patterns in contract language to identify how they needed to remediate those loans. Did the language indicate that the bank simply needed to advise the customer that they were moving to a new base rate that was not LIBOR? Did they need to renegotiate the loan with those rights given under the agreement? So we did analysis of the language using ActiveNAV to determine that, but that's not all we did. We did exactly what we're talking about here. We pulled out loan numbers, account numbers, tax ID numbers, and all sorts of other basically structured information from within the documents so that it was easier to create a workflow for the bank's employees to go begin to remediate this. Iron Mountain not only ran the software, but we provided other services to the bank to assist them with repapering the loans. The head of information governance told us, and hopefully we'll be able to put the name on this bank soon. He's agreed to let it be a named case study. But he told us that during the past year, with all the COVID PPP loans, their banking staff didn't have an opportunity or the time to deal with the LIBOR changeover. And that's the reason that they originally decided to use ActiveNAV and Iron Mountain to help them. But it turns out that ActiveNAV is sort of the Swiss Army knife of unstructured tools. There are just so many things you can use it for. Even before we finished this project, they said, listen, we have a bunch of wire transfer agreements that our internal audit staff found were not fully signed, or the amounts exceeded what was allowed. Could you use ActiveNAV software to identify those so that we can remediate those? And we did that, and then remote deposit agreements. And most recently, they've come to us and said, we have this old ECM system from a bank we acquired a while back. Can we use ActiveNAV to clean up the rot in that ECM platform and then migrate it to our main ECM platform? And hopefully that will be the next project we do for them. But that's the advantage of ActiveNAV software. You can use it for so many useful things that generate all sorts of business value. Well, yeah, that's what I said. This bank is now using ActiveNAV for other purposes, and we hope to help them retire 3 different enterprise content management platforms. And here the ROI was great. So we gave them the proposal for this, and based upon the maintenance they're paying for this old ECM platform, they said they can get an ROI within 18 months. Not only that, but they told us it's a pity they found out about ActiveNAV too late, because the previous year they had spent $60,000 to upgrade that software and the operating system. And that alone would have paid for the ActiveNAV project, but we're still looking at an ROI in less than a year and a half. So there's almost no limit to what you can pull out with ActiveNAV software. There's an electronics manufacturer who is pulling out part numbers from documents and spreadsheets. A heavy equipment manufacturer using it to identify vehicle identification numbers in unstructured documents. We talked about insurance carriers using it to find policy numbers and claim numbers. In life science, patient names and numbers are patent names and numbers are another example. And law firms can use it to identify client and matter numbers and then tie that into their time and billing systems or matter management systems. Steve, I think you get the last word in on this, don't you?
I'm happy to have the last word, Gary. You know that. But so to sum up some of the, and I know we've got a number of questions and we're going to address those in just a second. Obviously, you need to get the projects approved. And we are seeing that a lot of these projects that have been not roadblocked, but perhaps have had challenges getting funding, rolling that up into some of these transformation programs means that you can get to the goals that you've been after for a number of years, but on the back of something that really has the organization full square behind it. And why is it important? Well, we've talked a lot about business outcomes. And it's not just from a risk perspective, it's not just from a compliance records management perspective, but how can you help the organization work more effectively? I'm sure everyone's seen the research that says that the whole pandemic has resulted in large numbers of people reevaluating what they want to do with their lives, what careers they want to put in place. If those people walk out the door and the organization has no idea where the crown jewel data that they have been working on is, puts an organization in a tough spot. So getting your arms around this data and being proactive rather than reactive means that you are going to get significant business outcomes. Having that view of all your data, that 360-degree view, to enable you to make informed decisions, to look at improvements, to look at perhaps where there have been breakdowns in policy or process. Quite often we will find a lot of at-risk data that is a result of a broken process, such as an organization receiving data extracts or doing data dumps from their structured systems, using it for modeling purposes, and then never cleaning it up from shared drives. And you can end up with millions of files containing personal information or at-risk information, which obviously is not a good thing. And obviously, ROI is so important. And using some of the techniques and methods that we've talked about so far on this webinar means that you can realize ROI and get tangible ROI, not just soft benefits. So before we just wrap up, I can see that we have a number of questions. So if we can work through those. And
absolutely,
one of them,
Steve. So I'll go ahead and pitch it to you. So the first question we have, and for context, this one was asked closer to the beginning of the session. Is there any work being done on near duplicates?
Oh, that is a really good question. And also a really challenging question. The challenge with near duplicates is that you can look at find near duplicates, and it is possible to do that. The challenge is when we talk about minimizing the disruption to the business, you are going to get so many hits and so many false positives. It's going to make wading through and reviewing near duplicates, nigh on impossible. And we've seen this time and time again in the marketplace. There are other strategies and techniques that can be brought to bear that will minimize the disruption. For example, looking for metadata rules to look for pulling apart document names or folder names, for example, to look for version numbers that can then help us identify that these are different versions of the same document without trying to fingerprint the content and getting it horribly wrong. So I would always caution anyone who tells you that they can do near duplicates really well. I would caution against believing that, because it's a super challenging problem.
It's used mostly for e-discovery purposes to reduce the amount of review time for documents that are strikingly similar. But as Steve said, and we're doing a project for another bank at the moment that just split off from a parent bank, and we're classifying, cleaning up, and migrating their old unstructured information from shared drives. And they, like every other organization, has created variations of various draft documents and form documents. And we talked about trying to identify near duplicates, but we ended up agreeing with them that the only thing we want to absolutely get rid of are identical duplicates, keeping the master and getting rid of the many, many copies. And there are an awful lot of copies, because almost 40% of the unstructured corpus that we looked at was duplicate or trivial content. So even if you just get rid of duplicates and keep near duplicates, you're still going to have a very, very beneficial effect on the storage side of it. Let me take the second part of this. So metadata, well, one, how would you use it as part of a migration? So going back to the example I used earlier, if you have a master metadata management system, and you have entries in there for various applications that have policy number, we could then add the ActiveNAV SQL server as yet one more source that also has policy numbers. And if you were looking to have a single version of the truth on a single pane of glass, you could then do that query across both the structured apps as well as the ActiveNAV SQL server. And of course, from the SQL server, we can actually pull up the documents themselves. So is all of this better than full text search? I come from
Gary, let me pitch the question for the audience here. The question was, Gary can see it in the chat for those of you
I
watching.
thought everybody could see the chat.
No, it's okay. It's okay. So the question for this one that Gary's on is, how can metadata be used to retrieve information and records, and is it better than a full text search?
I have a background in litigation and e-discovery, and there was a famous study done decades ago where they found that lawyers using full text search usually only found, I think it was 23–25% of the information they were looking for, because most people are not very good at constructing full text searches. And also because when you do full text searches, there are a lot of false positives. If I really wanted to interrogate a system, I would use both fielded metadata-based search and full text. And you can compare the result sets, see if there are too many false positives in one, or if you've missed things doing just metadata, and have really the best of both worlds. Steve, what do you think?
Horses for courses. I don't know if that is actually even an American saying, but what I mean by that is both have a role to play. Full text searching, absolutely. If you imagine, as part of being able to search large corpuses of data for certain terms, effectively and quickly is very, very helpful for users. However, the full text search results, we have seen numerous instances of organizations that have said, great, we're going to put full text search on top of our data and our problems are solved. Users can find information. You bet they can. I'm not going to name the client, but this one client rolled out full text search on SharePoint and they had to shut it down within 3 hours because users were able to search for data and they were finding all sorts of information that they should never have been able to see. And why was that? Because they hadn't taken the time to create the whole set of rich metadata and to restructure and reorganize their information so that the data could be secured and protected and only the relevant information would get into people's hands. But they had bypassed that and gone to full text search and said that solves our problem. It actually made a massive problem for them. And so that's why I say horses for courses. You need to be able to understand what risk you're going to be exposing before you put in place full text search. And therefore, by restructuring and creating this metadata means you can control access and what can leave the organization and will therefore make full text search more effective and less embarrassing.
And you know, I said earlier that ActiveNAV was the Swiss Army knife of unstructured tools. So one other thing we have available to us is what ActiveNAV calls themes, I believe. And that is the ability to, it's almost like concept-based search, but it's the ability to distill from a collection of documents what the concepts or themes are that are in there and which ones are used most predominantly. And you can use that as another way to navigate to the content. In fact, we just closed a deal a couple of weeks ago in the federal government space with ActiveNAV. This agency originally said, well, gee, can you start with a professional services engagement to interview all of our users and figure out what kinds of documents they have? And we said, no, there's a better way to do this. Let's index them with ActiveNAV, use the theme capability in ActiveNAV, and we'll tell them the 100 most common themes in all of the documents, which will then serve as a proxy for them understanding what kinds of documents they actually create. Because users, if we sit users down in a room, in this case, they're lawyers, and say, well, gee, tell us what kinds of documents you create, they won't know. They certainly won't know the full list. On the other hand, if we show them a list of, here are the 100 kinds of documents you've mostly created in your repository, any you want to add to this, any you want to take off this list, it's going to save them a great deal of time and effort, and it's going to be a much more accurate representation of the kinds of documents they actually create.
Great, lots to think about there. So I'll pitch you guys another question, and then Steve, I think you have a couple more slides there. But before we go to those, something we get asked a lot is how to get the backing for the tools that you've mentioned to enable these processes. And certainly the case studies were very compelling, but for someone who is climbing uphill internally in their organization, what are some tips that you have to show the value of these projects and these tools?
I think I'll take that first part, Gary, and then hand over to you.
Sure.
I think there's a number of components that can assist with that. The first of which is that typically these transformation programs, metadata governance, however you want to describe it, impact the organization as a whole rather than silos of the organization. And so there are multiple stakeholders, and you need all of those stakeholders on board to make the case to a committee or whatever the approval process is for funding. So don't be an island. Make sure that you have all the relevant stakeholders, that all that homework has been done so that everyone's on the same page to look at getting that funding. Another way of approaching this is to run a small scale pilot, proof of concept, again, however you want to describe it, and to show the business value that will be achieved. by implementing this across the organization. But it's important if you do that, that you have a whole set of success criteria or goals or outcomes that you're looking to achieve that you can then sell internally as to why you need funding for this program. That could be, again, around the use cases, around data risk, data privacy, being able to do subject access requests. Could be about securing and protecting your crown jewel data. Could be reducing costs through eliminating stale and redundant data. Could be a whole raft of different scenarios. And again, this is where it becomes very important to tie it into the multiple stakeholders, because cyber has an interest, IT has an interest, legal has an interest, compliance has an interest, and their desired outcomes could be very different to each other's. And therefore you want to be able to satisfy and tick the boxes for each of their use cases, which again means that you can go and request the funding saying this is going to solve not just one problem, but multiple problems.
I would just add to that typically there are hard dollar savings if you reduce storage, particularly if it's on-premise storage. Not only will you be saving on future storage acquisitions, but your cost for backup, your cost for storage deduplication, all of those things have subscription licenses that will be reduced, and that's all good. But usually the hard dollar costs alone pale in comparison to the less tangible benefits. So we live in the age of ransomware and cybercrime. And if you can reduce a petabyte of information to 250 terabytes, your ability to protect that information will increase. Your cost to protect it will decrease. And that's all good. Same thing with privacy and the potential penalties for, we now live in, it used to be the case that forever people kept as many copies as they wanted for as long as they wanted, and their regulators never said boo. We now live in an age where most of our business, at least on my side, and I'm a records management company, most of my business is not being driven by people who want to make sure they're keeping all the records they're supposed to keep. It's being driven by people who want to make sure they're getting rid of all of the records they have to get rid of, because under all of the privacy regimes in the world today, whether we're talking about GDPR, CCPA, the insurance, the NAIC insurance model law, you need to be able to demonstrate to your regulators that you're getting rid of all the documents that have PII when you no longer have a legal basis to have them. And the penalties for those privacy violations are frequently higher than the penalties for failure to keep what you were supposed to have kept. So that's how you build a business case. It depends upon what business you're in, is to reuse Steve's metaphor, horses for courses. The business case for a government agency is going to frequently be based on things like the cost of doing FOIA requests. Whereas if you're an insurance company, it's going to be based more on compliance with insurance and privacy laws. So both ActiveNAV and Iron Mountain are happy to help you with that business case. But as Steve said earlier, starting out with a POC or a pilot, looking at the data and extrapolating from that to your entire enterprise corpus is the way you can demonstrate what that return on investment really is.
Fantastic. Thank you both. And we have another question that just came in. If you could speak to financial dark data that's stored outside of an ERP, that would be fantastic.
Okay, absolutely. So part of this is that organizations can receive data, and it could be financial data, from outside organizations to load up into their different database systems, ERPs, whatever it may be. And likewise, may also do data extracts for data modeling purposes, for actuarial purposes, as one example. And the challenge with that is a lot of that data whether it relates to individuals or other organizations, be highly sensitive. And once it's in the application, the master repository, the master record, if you like, it can be secured and protected in there. It's put on a file share, even if nominally temporarily, it can be a huge risk. We have experience of organizations, I'll give you an example, where in one location, they had 1,000 zip files. Inside those 1,000 zip files were 2 million files. Each and every one of them were XML files containing customer PII. Now that data existed in some other application or system, but it was a transitory nature, or should have been, but it was there for a number of years. And by shining a light on that dark data, we were able to expose that broken process in order that it could be cleaned up. And so this financial dark data, if you like, by inventorying and understanding what content is out there, we can start shining a light and finding that dark data so that we can take steps to secure, protect it, or eliminate it.
All right, great. Oh, go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, there's another one out there. You may not have seen it in the Q&A.
Yep.
Perfect. Go for it. So the question is, how useful is this approach for dealing with emails and email archives?
I'm sat here shuddering. Email, I would say, is a very different problem from even the structured data and the unstructured data. Our experiences have been that email is such a dynamically changing environment that using technology to police that for every email message from a data governance perspective, I'm not talking about a scanning perspective, but can be problematic. And so from a retention perspective with emails, what we typically see and typically recommend is it's about process and policy. And so being able to have a corporate policy that says all emails, unless it's declared a record, will only be stored or kept for X period of time, after which it can be disposed of, is typically the way to go from a disposition perspective. Now, of course, there'll be exceptions to that, but that's a pragmatic approach. And email really does require a pragmatic approach because it's so different. If you imagine, if you index a set of emails right now, by the time it finishes, it's out of date. There could be another 300-400 emails coming in the intervening period. So you're constantly playing catch up. And so we would certainly I would certainly strongly recommend a slightly different approach. And this is why this whole holistic approach is important, because it is horses for courses. What works for file share data might not necessarily work for email, which might not necessarily work for structured. So you need to have the right strategies in place.
All right, fantastic. Well, that wraps up our questions, and back over to your slides, Steve.
Okay, well, I'll skip through this one very quickly. The obligatory about ActiveNAV. Well, our solution that we've deployed across the marketplace, it is about pragmatic. And again, harking back to people, process, and technology. And it's all about helping organizations get their arms around all this stuff and manage it more effectively. And it's software, most importantly, it's being designed specifically for these data governance problems. It's not, for example, an e-discovery application trying to shoehorn itself into a data governance solution. It's also highly scalable. Our largest customer, we have over 8 petabytes of data and 2 billion files indexed globally. So this will actually works at scale and helps organizations really manage all of that stuff and dark data that's been collected over the years.
And here's the obligatory Iron Mountain commercial. So we are the largest information governance records management firm in the world. And our view of how to address this starts with strategy, works its way through implementation of tools like ActiveNAV, and we even can provide ActiveNAV as part of a managed service where we basically become your electronic records management department. Really depends. We sell it however you want to buy it. We have more practitioners than anybody on the planet. We have scores of certified ActiveNAV architects and engineers, and all the other people that are needed to help deal with everything from policy to retention schedules in combination with ActiveNAV software.
All right, fantastic. So you have one more slide there. It'll show your contact information. So now that you've covered the slides that marketing tells you to put in there, we will wrap up for today. If you have any further questions for Steve or for Gary, their contact information is up here on the screen. We thank you all for joining us. We hope you have a good evening, good afternoon, rest of your day. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.